Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Olympic National Park, Washington, October 2011. The satellite phone's tinny ring cut through the sound of rain hammering Michael Hayes' cabin roof. He stared at the device for 3 rings before answering, already knowing this wouldn't be routine. Normal calls came through the radio. Satellite meant someone had bypassed protocol. "This is Ranger Hayes." "Please." The woman's voice cracked immediately. "Please, you have to find my daughter." Michael closed his eyes. 8 years in Olympic National Park, and these calls still hit the same way. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down. Tell me your daughter's name." "Sarah Chen. She's been missing since Monday morning, and the police say they're doing everything they can, but..." A sob interrupted her. "She called me Sunday night. She said the forest was beautiful, but something felt wrong. That was the last time I heard her voice." Michael pulled a notepad closer, his hand steady despite the familiar weight settling in his chest. The weight that always came with searches. The weight that had been there since 2003. What trail was she hiking? Ho River Trail. She's a wildlife photographer. She was supposed to check in every day, but... Mrs. Chen. Michael kept his voice level, professional. "I'm going to find her. But I need you to tell me everything Sarah said in that last call." The details came in fragments. Sarah Chen, 28, experienced hiker, proper gear, solo trip to photograph Roosevelt elk in their natural habitat. She'd camped near the 5-mile island, called her mother around 9 p.m., said the forest was darker than she expected, said she kept hearing footsteps behind her on the trail, but whenever she turned around, nothing was there, said she felt like she was being followed by someone who didn't want to be seen. "And one more thing," Mrs. Chen whispered. "She said she met another hiker, a man named David. She said he seemed lost, confused about where the trail went. She was going to help him find his way back to the ranger station the next morning." Michael's pen stopped moving. "David? Did she give a last name?" "No, just David. Is that important?" He thought about telling her. Thought about explaining that in the 8 years he'd worked Olympic National Park, he'd never heard of a hiker named David getting lost on Ho River Trail. Thought about mentioning that the trail was straightforward, nearly impossible to get confused on unless you deliberately left the marked path. Thought about 2003. "I'll call you as soon as I have news," he said instead. The rain was heavier in the forest. Michael had learned to distinguish between the types of rain in Olympic: the mist that hung suspended like breath, the drizzle that could last weeks, the downpour that turned trails to rivers. This was the third kind, and it had been falling for 36 hours. His GPS unit showed Sarah's last known position, a campsite 5.2 miles in, just past the grove of the Patriarch's Junction. Search and rescue had already combed the area twice. They'd found her tent, her camera equipment neatly stored, her sleeping bag unused. No signs of struggle, no signs of anything. She'd simply vanished between sunset and sunrise. Michael adjusted his pack and started hiking. The trail was familiar enough that he could navigate it in full darkness, which was good, because even at 10 a.m. the canopy kept everything in perpetual twilight. Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose 300 feet above him, their trunks wider than his cabin. Moss covered everything, muffling sound, making the forest feel more underwater than above it. He'd been hiking for an hour when he saw the first marker. Not an official Park Service marker. A piece of orange surveyor's tape tied to a branch about 10 feet off the trail. Michael stopped. Rangers didn't use tape in the Ho rainforest. The preserve was too delicate. This was something else. He pulled out his radio. "Hayes to base." Static, then Jennifer's voice. "Go ahead, Michael." "Did SNR mark any of their search patterns with tape?" A pause. "Negative. They used flags. Why?" "Found surveyor's tape off the main trail. Probably nothing. But he photographed it anyway." the orange vivid against the green. He continued hiking. Found 3 more pieces of tape in the next mile, each one leading slightly away from the established trail. Each one placed higher than a hiker would naturally reach. Each one exactly the same shade of orange. At mile 4, he found Sarah's water bottle. It was sitting upright on a fallen log, 20 yards from the trail, cap screwed on tight. No scratches, no dirt. It looked like someone had placed it there carefully, deliberately, like they wanted it to be found. Michael's throat tightened. He'd seen this before. The too neat evidence, the trail that was too obvious, the feeling that he was being led somewhere specific. Stephanie Morrison, age 33, vanished from the Enchanted Valley Trail. Michael had been the one to find her jacket, folded neatly on a rock beside the river. He'd followed the trail of her belongings, each item placed with unnatural precision, deeper into the forest. Found her boots, her backpack, her camera. Found her, or what was left after she'd walked into the Quinault River and drowned, 50 feet from where he stood, while he was photographing her abandoned camera, trying to understand why someone would undress systematically before walking into freezing water. The autopsy said, hypothermia-induced paradoxical undressing. The report said she'd gotten disoriented, succumbed to the cold. Case closed. But Michael had seen her face in those last photos on her camera, seen her expression in the selfies she'd taken in her final hours. She didn't look cold. She didn't look disoriented. She looked like she'd been talking to someone, smiling at someone, following someone. The department therapist said it was trauma response, seeing patterns where none existed, said he needed to process the guilt of not reaching her in time. Prescribed medication Michael never took and recommended leave Michael never used. 8 years later, he still saw Stephanie's face when he closed his eyes. Michael picked up Sarah's water bottle with gloved hands, bagged it, marked the location on his GPS, tried to ignore how perfectly it matched the pattern. Haze to base. Go ahead. Found evidence, 20 yards west of the trail at mile 4. I'm going to keep following the markers. Michael, wait for SNR backup. Sarah's been missing 36 hours. If she's injured, another hour won't matter. Protocol says. He turned off the radio. The markers led him off trail, deeper into old-growth territory where the forest floor was a maze of nurse logs and devil's club. The rain intensified, turning everything slick. Michael's boots slipped on wet bark and he caught himself against a massive hemlock, feeling the moss compress under his palm like wet sponge. That's when he saw the man. He was standing about 40 feet ahead, partially obscured by a massive spruce trunk. Jeans, blue rain jacket, hiking boots. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing away from Michael. Hey, Michael called out. You okay? The man turned slowly. He was young, maybe early 30s, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain. His expression was blank, distant. I think I'm lost, he said. Michael approached carefully. What's your name? David. The man blinked water from his eyes. David. I don't remember my last name. Isn't that strange? I can't remember how I got here. Every instinct Michael had developed in 8 years started screaming. David, when did you start your hike? I don't. David looked around, confused. Recently, I think. I was looking for the ranger station. Someone was supposed to help me. A woman, she had a camera. Have you seen her? Michael's hand moved to his radio instinctively, then remembered he'd turned it off. Sarah? You met Sarah Chen? Sarah. David's face brightened. Yes. Sarah. She was kind. She said she'd help me find my way back. We were supposed to meet in the morning, but I can't find her. I've been walking in circles. David, what trail did you start from? I don't remember. He looked genuinely distressed now. Why can't I remember? This isn't right. Nothing about this is right. Michael studied him. David wasn't dressed for serious hiking. His jacket was too light for October. His boots looked new, unused. No pack, no water, no gear. He should have been hypothermic after 36 hours in this rain, but he wasn't shivering. David, Are you hurt? I don't think so. David looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. I don't feel anything, actually. Shouldn't I feel cold? We need to get you to the station. Can you walk? I've been walking. David's voice took on a strange quality, almost childlike. I've been walking for so long, following the trail, trying to get back, but nothing changes. The trees all look the same. The rain never stops, and I'm so tired of walking. He looked directly at Michael, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something that wasn't confusion. You seem familiar, David said quietly. Have we met before? Michael's blood went cold, because now, looking at David's face in the gray light filtering through the canopy, he did recognize him. Not from the past few years. From before. From 2003. David Morrison. Stephanie's brother. The one who'd come to the park after her death, demanding answers. The one who'd hiked into the Enchanted Valley against all advice, trying to understand what had happened to his sister. The one who'd never come back out. You're not real, Michael whispered. David tilted his head. I feel real. Don't I look real? He held up his hands. I can see my hands. I can hear the rain. How can I not be real? David Morrison disappeared in 2003, 9 years ago. That's not... David's expression crumbled. No, that's not right. I just got here. I was looking for my sister, Stephanie. She died here, and I needed to understand why. I needed... His voice faded. How long have I been walking? Michael took a step back. His rational mind, the part trained in search and rescue, the part that believed in evidence and protocol, was fighting against what he was seeing. But the other part, the part that had never been able to explain Stephanie's death, was screaming at him to run. You need to help me, David said, and there was desperation in his voice now. Please, I'm so lost. I don't know how to get out. The trail just keeps going. The forest never ends. I've been alone for so long. I can't help you. Yes, you can. You're a ranger. You know these trails. You can show me the way out. David moved closer, and Michael noticed he wasn't leaving footprints in the soft ground. Please, I just want to go home. I just want to stop walking. Where's Sarah? David blinked. Sarah? Sarah Chen, the woman you met. Where is she? She's following the trail. I showed her the way someone showed me. David's face softened into something like a smile. She's not lost anymore. None of us are lost. We're just walking until we find it. Find what? The place where the trail ends. Michael's heart hammered. Take me to her. I can show you the way, David said. But once you start following, you can't turn back. The trail doesn't allow it. That's the rule. That's always been the rule. Show me. David studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You were there when Stephanie died. I remember now. You tried to save her, but you were too late. You've been carrying that with you. Take me to Sarah. She's at the end, David said simply. Where the trail ends. Where we all end up eventually. He turned and started walking deeper into the forest off any mapped path, into territory where the old growth was so dense that the canopy blocked out all light. Michael followed. They walked for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. Time moved strangely here, stretched and compressed. The rain continued, but Michael noticed he could no longer hear it hitting the ground. Just a constant white noise, like static. David moved through the forest like he was part of it, never stumbling, never hesitating. His feet passed over roots and through undergrowth without disturbing anything. You know what the hardest part is? David said without turning around. Realizing that you're not who you thought you were, that the story you told yourself about your life wasn't true. David, I thought I came here to find my sister, to get answers. But the truth is, I came here to join her. I just didn't know it yet. He glanced back. What did you come here for, Michael? To find Sarah. No, You came here to finish something, to make up for what happened in 2003, to prove you could save someone this time. David stopped walking. But what if saving her means following her all the way to the end? They had reached a clearing Michael didn't recognize. In the center stood a massive cedar, its trunk split by lightning at some point in the distant past, creating a hollow chamber inside. The damage was old, the exposed wood gray and weathered. Sarah was sitting at the base of the tree. She looked alive. Her hair was wet, her clothing damp, but she wasn't showing signs of hypothermia. She was staring at her hands with an expression of profound confusion. Sarah. Michael rushed forward, but David's hand caught his arm. The touch was cold, not the cold of living flesh exposed to rain, but something else, something absent of temperature entirely. She can't hear you yet, David said. She's still in between, still trying to understand. Sarah Chen. Michael pulled free and dropped to his knees beside her. Sarah, can you hear me? Your mother is looking for you. I'm here to take you home. Sarah's eyes slowly focused on him. Ranger Hayes? Yes, I'm here. Are you hurt? I don't... She looked around the clearing, disoriented. I was hiking. There was a man, David. He said he was lost. I was going to help him find the ranger station in the morning, but when I woke up, my tent was gone. Everything was gone. I've been trying to find my way back, but... Her voice cracked. How long have I been out here? 36 hours. That's not possible. She stood up, stumbling. Michael caught her, feeling the solid weight of her body. She was real. She was alive. I've been walking for days, weeks. I can't tell anymore. And I'm not hungry. I'm not cold. Why am I not cold? We need to get you out of here. She won't leave, David said quietly. He was standing at the edge of the clearing now, watching them. None of us can leave, not once we've found this place. Shut up. Michael pulled out his GPS unit. The screen showed nothing but static. His radio produced only white noise. The compass in his pack was spinning slowly, unable to find north. Sarah was looking at David. You're still here. I never left. But you said if I followed the trail, I'd find the way out. I said you'd find the end of the trail. David's expression was sad. I never said that was the same thing as the way out. Michael stood, putting himself between Sarah and David. We're leaving, now. You can try, David said. Stephanie tried, I tried, we all try. He gestured to the forest around them. But the forest is bigger than maps, older than trails, and once it decides you belong here, it doesn't let go easily. I don't belong here. Don't you? David moved closer, and Michael saw that his eyes were empty, reflective, like dark water. You've been walking these trails for 8 years, carrying Stephanie's death like a stone. Every search, every rescue, you're trying to rewrite what happened, trying to prove you deserve to be called a ranger instead of the man who let someone die. That's not... You turn off your radio, break protocol, go deeper than backup can follow. David's voice was gentle. You're not trying to save people, Michael. You're trying to join them. You're trying to find whatever it was that Stephanie found in those final moments. The thing that made her smile as she walked into the water. Michael's hands were shaking. What are you? I'm lost, David said simply. We all are. Lost hikers, lost rangers, lost souls. The forest collects us, keeps us, and eventually we become part of the pattern. We become the markers that lead others here. Sarah made a sound, half sob, half laugh. The orange tape. I found it too. I thought it was trail markers. It is, David said. Just not the kind you think. We mark the way for those who are ready to stop walking, who are ready to find the place where the trail ends. There is no end, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Because he was remembering 2003, remembering how Stephanie's belongings had been placed too perfectly, remembering the other searches over the years, the vanished hikers who left neat trails of evidence. the bodies found in places that made no sense, wearing expressions of strange peace, remembering how many times he'd felt watched in these woods, how many times he'd heard footsteps behind him on empty trails, how many times he'd seen movement in his peripheral vision that vanished when he turned to look. "What happens if we stay?" he asked. "You walk," David said. "You keep walking until you understand that you were always meant to find this place, that everything in your life led here." And then he smiled, and it was the saddest smile Michael had ever seen. "Then you don't feel lost anymore. You feel like you've finally found home." Sarah was standing now, and when Michael looked at her, he saw that her eyes had taken on the same empty quality as David's, reflective, distant. "It's not so bad," she said softly. "Once you stop fighting, once you accept that you're not going back, the fear goes away, everything goes away, and you're just here, always here, part of the rain and the trees and the darkness." "No." Michael grabbed her arm, but his hand passed through her like she was made of mist. "No. You're alive. You're real." "Am I?" She looked down at herself. "I can't remember the last time I felt hungry. Can't remember feeling my heartbeat. Can't remember." Her voice faded to a whisper. "Can't remember why I wanted to leave." Michael backed away from both of them. His rational mind was fracturing, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be true. This was impossible. Ghosts weren't real. Lost souls weren't real. But Stephanie had been real. David had been real, and they'd both vanished in these woods. "I'm going back," he said. "I'm finding the trail, and I'm going back, and I'm calling in a full search team. We're going to find a rational explanation for all of this." "Of course you are," David said. "That's what Stephanie said too. That's what I said. That's what everyone says." He pointed deeper into the forest. "The trail is that way. You can follow it back, but you should know. The forest is patient, and it's already marked you. You'll come back. They always come back." Michael ran. He ran through the old growth, crashing through undergrowth, his breath coming in gasps. His legs burned. His lungs ached. He ran until he found something that looked like a trail, then followed it, GPS useless, compass spinning. Nothing but his own sense of direction to guide him. He ran until he saw orange tape tied to a branch, then more tape, then Sarah's water bottle, sitting upright on a log. He was back at the clearing with the lightning-struck cedar. David and Sarah were gone, but he could hear them in the forest calling to him. Not with voices, but with something else. A pulling sensation, like gravity drawing him deeper. Michael ran again. Different direction this time. Ran until his muscles gave out, until he collapsed against a massive spruce gasping. Found himself back at the clearing. The third time, he didn't run. He walked slowly, deliberately, trying every technique he'd learned in 8 years of search and rescue, following water drainage, marking trees, using the angle of rare sunlight. The clearing found him anyway. On the 7th return, Michael stopped fighting. He sat down at the base of the lightning-struck cedar and tried to think. His watch showed 4:47 p.m. He'd been in the forest for 6 hours. His radio remained static. His GPS showed coordinates that placed him 200 miles away in the Pacific Ocean. He thought about Jennifer, waiting at the base station. About Mrs. Chen, waiting for news of her daughter. About the search teams that would come looking for him when he failed to report in. About how they'd find his equipment neatly arranged at some point along the trail. About how they'd search for days, weeks, until finally declaring him lost to the wilderness. About how eventually some other ranger would take his place, walking these same trails, searching for lost souls, and maybe one day that ranger would meet a helpful man named Michael, who seemed a bit confused about where he was, who just wanted to find his way back to the station. The rain continued. The forest waited. Michael Hayes stood up and started walking deeper into the trees. 3 days later, Olympic National Park suspended the search for rangers Michael Hayes and photographer Sarah Chen. Their equipment was found at various points along Ho River Trail, placed with unusual precision. No bodies were recovered. In the official report, the Park Service attributed both disappearances to disorientation and hypothermia, complicated by heavy rainfall and low visibility. The tape markings found throughout the search area were determined to be of unknown origin. The case remains open. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more immersive stories. What's your interpretation of Michael's fate? Did the forest truly claim him, or did his guilt finally manifest into something he couldn't escape? I'd love to hear your theories in the comments. Tentar novamente. The moss had stopped making sense 3 hours ago. Christopher Hayes stood at the base of a Sitka spruce, his hand pressed against bark that felt too warm for October, and studied the emerald growth spiraling up the trunk in a pattern that defied the usual north-facing logic. 9 hours into the search for Madison Porter, and the forest was showing him things he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. His radio crackled. "Ranger Hayes, this is base. Any sign?" Christopher's thumb hovered over the transmit button. Through the perpetual mist of the Ho rainforest, visibility extended maybe 40 feet before the temperate rainforest swallowed everything in gray-green twilight. His GPS had started glitching an hour ago, coordinates jumping, then freezing, then displaying numbers that placed him somewhere in the middle of the Ho River itself. "Negative," he said, continuing north toward the High Ho Trail junction. "Copy that. Weather Service says fog's going to thicken after 1600 hours. You've got maybe 2 hours of workable visibility." Christopher checked his watch. 2:47 p.m. He'd been moving since 5:30 that morning, when Madison's research advisor had called the ranger station in a panic. The young woman had missed her scheduled radio check-in at midnight, then again at 6 a.m. Her last transmission, recorded on the station system, had been routine. Day 3 of survey complete. Invasive plant specimens collected from Quadrant 7, setting up camp near. Then nothing. Not static, not interference. Just silence, as if someone had reached through the radio waves and switched her off. The forest pressed in. That was the thing about the Ho. 15 feet of elevation. But the trees made you forget sky existed. Big leaf maples dripped with club moss. Nurse logs sprouted entire ecosystems. Every surface crawled with life feeding on decay. Beautiful, people said. Christopher had learned to see it differently. He pushed through a curtain of sword ferns, their fronds leaving cold moisture on his jacket. His pack held everything protocol demanded: first aid kit, emergency shelter, water purification tablets, MREs, headlamp, spare batteries, compass, whistle, bear spray. The familiar weight should have been comforting. It wasn't. Madison. His voice disappeared into the vegetation, absorbed before it could echo. Madison Porter. Nothing, but then he hadn't expected an answer. His boot caught on something, not a root, but a strap. Christopher knelt, pulling aside ferns to reveal a green backpack with UW biology depth, stenciled on the back. Madison's. The contents were scattered: waterlogged notebooks, specimen bags torn open, a water bottle crushed flat as if stepped on by something with considerable weight. But no blood. No signs of struggle, just destruction that seemed almost casual, the way a curious animal might investigate an interesting smell. Christopher's hands shook as he documented the find with his camera. The shaking annoyed him. He'd been a ranger for 14 years. Worked 3 missing persons cases before that summer in 2006 when he stood abruptly, slinging the ruined backpack over his shoulder. Madison had been traveling light for her survey work, which meant her camping gear should be nearby. He scanned the area, looking for the telltale orange or blue of modern tents, and that's when he heard it. Singing. Not quite singing. More like the memory of singing, thin and distant. Words impossible to make out. Christopher's jaw tightened. He knew what his mind was doing. The way isolation and exhaustion could resurrect old fears. 5 years ago, he'd spent 3 days searching for 2 lost hikers in the Kino Valley. And on the 3rd day, He'd heard voices that couldn't have been real, seen shapes moving between trees that left no tracks. When he'd finally stumbled back to the ranger station, half mad with dehydration and hypothermia, his colleagues had nodded with understanding. The forest played tricks, happened to experienced rangers, nothing to be ashamed of. But Christopher had heard the official reports about the 1987 Camp Whispering Pines incident. 23 Boy Scouts and 4 adult leaders buried under 12 tons of earth when the hillside gave way during spring rains. The camp had been positioned in a geologically unstable ravine. Criminal negligence, the investigation had concluded. The bodies had taken 6 days to recover, and afterward, the site was declared too dangerous for any kind of memorial. Nature had reclaimed it quickly. Salal bushes, devil's club, and eventually nurse logs that sprouted new trees. The forest ate its dead efficiently. The singing came again, closer now. Multiple voices, young and high, forming harmonies that didn't quite align. Christopher recognized the melody. Kumbaya, that universal campfire song. But something was wrong with the timing, as if each voice was singing at its own pace, layered over each other in a nauseating round. "Hello?" he called, hating the tremor in his voice. "This is Park Service. If you're lost, stay where you are. I'm coming to you." The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, Christopher heard water dripping, branches creaking, his own pulse hammering in his ears. Then, from somewhere ahead and slightly downhill, "Help." The word was spoken by what sounded like a dozen mouths at once, children's voices overlapping, some urgent, some almost playful, some stretched out like a recording played too slow. Christopher's training fought with his instinct to run. Madison was out here, 23 years old, probably terrified, definitely in danger. Whether that danger was natural or otherwise didn't change his responsibility. He moved toward the voice, one hand on his bear spray, the other holding his radio like a talisman. The ground sloped downward, treacherous with hidden roots and wet leaves. His boots struggled for purchase. The mist grew thicker, reducing visibility to 20 feet, then 10. The trees here looked older, their trunks wider, bark rough with age. He was descending into one of the hoe's ancient pockets, places where the forest canopy locked out so much light that understory growth thinned, creating cathedral-like spaces between the giants. "Madison!" he shouted. "Madison, if you can hear me, make noise. Whistle, shout, bang on something." "Christopher." He froze. His name, spoken in that same layered voice chorus, but this time with a note of recognition, of knowledge. Christopher Hayes. They knew his name. It knew his name. Christopher's breath came faster now, fogging in air that had suddenly grown colder. Temperature drops in rainforests weren't unusual. Cold air pooled in low spots, especially near water, but this was different. This was the kind of cold that came from inside, spreading outward. "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to sound authoritative. "Identify yourself." Laughter. Multiple children laughing, the sound cascading from different directions, echoing off the moss-covered trunks. Not cruel laughter, not even mocking. Just amused, the way kids might laugh at an adult asking an obvious question. Christopher's GPS beeped. He looked down at the screen and felt his stomach drop. The coordinates now read N47.88619 degree, W123.9361 degree. The exact location of the old Camp Whispering Pines disaster site. But that was impossible. He was at least 3 miles north of that ravine. He'd been walking north all day, away from the historical site. His compass confirmed north. The sun's position confirmed north. And yet, "We've been waiting," the voices said. And this time they came from behind him. Christopher spun, his hand dropping to the canister of bear spray. Through the mist he saw movement. Small shapes, child height, flitting between the trees with a fluidity that seemed wrong. They moved too quickly, changed direction without the hesitation of real bodies navigating terrain. For just a moment, as one passed through a shaft of filtered light, Christopher saw details. A Boy Scout uniform, the fabric stained with earth, the neckerchief still perfectly knotted. Then it was gone, absorbed back into the gray. "Madison Porter," Christopher said, forcing his voice steady. "I'm looking for Madison Porter. Have you seen her?" "We've all seen her," the voices replied, now from his left. "She came to study the plants, to catalog the invasive species. But some things can't be cataloged, Christopher. Some things don't fit in specimen bags." "Where is she?" His voice cracked on the last word. "Where we all are. Where you've been trying not to be. The place you ran from." The memories hit him like a physical blow. June 2006. The Knoll search. 2 hikers, experienced, well-equipped, who'd simply vanished on a routine day hike. Christopher had been younger then, more confident, certain that his skills and training could solve any wilderness emergency. 3 days searching, pushing deeper into the backcountry than protocol recommended. And on that 3rd night, his headlamp battery dying, radio out of range, he'd heard children singing, "Row, row, row your boat," in round after round that never ended. He'd seen scouts in vintage uniforms standing in a circle around his tent. He'd watched as trees rearranged themselves, trails he'd marked disappeared, and time itself seemed to fold in on itself. They'd found him half frozen, babbling, his gear scattered as if he'd been running. The hikers were never found. Christopher had filed his report, listened to the gentle explanations about stress and hypothermia-induced hallucinations, and accepted reassignment to Olympic National Park, far from the Knoll Valley. Far from the place where 27 people had died under tons of earth, their young voices silenced mid-song. Except he wasn't far from it anymore. Somehow, despite walking north for 9 hours, despite his compass and his training and the maps he knew by heart, the forest had brought him back to the ravine. "You can't keep us here," Christopher said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the voices or to himself. "Madison Porter is a living person who needs help. Whatever you are, whatever you want, she has nothing to do with... She has everything to do with it." The voices interrupted, and now they sounded sad, not angry. Sad. "She came to study invasion. But we've been here longer than your invasive species. Longer than your trails and your ranger stations and your tidy explanations. The earth opened and swallowed us, Christopher, and we're still swallowing." Movement in his peripheral vision. Christopher turned to see a young woman stumbling through the ferns, her clothes torn, face streaked with mud. Madison. She was alive. "Madison!" Christopher lunged forward, closing the distance between them. "Are you hurt? Can you walk?" But as he reached her, Madison looked up with eyes that held too much white, her mouth opening to reveal that same layered voice. "We're all Madison now. We're all Christopher. We're all the scouts who sang until the soil filled our mouths." Christopher stumbled backward, his boot catching on exposed root. He went down hard, his radio flying from his belt and skittering into the undergrowth. Madison, or the thing wearing Madison's shape, moved closer, her movements jerky, wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. "You left us," the chorus said through her mouth. "In 2006, you heard us calling and you ran. You told yourself it wasn't real. But we were real, Christopher. We are real. As real as the earth that crushed us. As real as the fear in our hearts when we realized no one was coming. As real as the darkness that took us one by one." Christopher's hand found his whistle, standard issue Fox 40, capable of 120 decibels. He brought it to his lips and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for distress. The sound cut through the mist, clear and sharp and human. For a moment, everything stopped. The voices fell silent. The Madison thing paused mid-step. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then came response whistles. Real whistles, from multiple directions. His search team spread throughout the forest, converging on his signal. The Madison thing tilted its head, listening. "They won't find you," it said. But now the voice sounded less certain. "The forest keeps what it takes." "No," Christopher said, climbing to his feet. His legs shook, but he kept his voice firm. "That's what you tell yourselves. That's the story you've built from tragedy and trauma. But Madison Porter walked into these woods alive, and she's going to walk out alive. And if I have to drag both of you, the real Madison and whatever you've become, Into the light to make that happen, I will. He blew the whistle again. Longer this time. 6 short blasts. Emergency. Need immediate assistance. The response whistles grew closer. Christopher could hear voices now. Real, solid, human voices calling his name. His team, his colleagues, his anchor to the world above the ravine. The Madison thing began to flicker, like a projection losing power. Behind it, Christopher saw other shapes. Small figures in scout uniforms, their faces obscured by shadow and soil, their hands reaching not in threat, but in longing. "We just wanted someone to hear us," the voices said. And now they sounded like what they were. Children, frightened, lost, desperate to be found. We sang and sang, but the earth was so heavy. So heavy. Christopher understood then, not forgiveness. He wasn't sure he could forgive what they'd done to Madison, to the hikers in 2006, to anyone else who'd wandered into their grief. But understanding. They hadn't meant to trap anyone. They were the trapped ones, caught in the moment of their deaths, endlessly calling for help that had come too late. "I hear you," he said quietly. "I heard you in 2006, and I hear you now. 27 people died in that ravine. Camp Whispering Pines, May 1987. I know what happened to you." The shapes grew more distinct. Boys in neckerchiefs and merit badges. Adult leaders with clipboards still clutched in translucent hands. All of them frozen at various ages, various stages of panic and acceptance. "But Madison is alive," Christopher continued. "She's 23 years old. She's studying biology. She has a future, which is something you didn't get. Don't take that from her. Please." The forest brightened. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift, as if clouds had parted somewhere far above the canopy. Christopher heard his team crashing through the undergrowth, close now, maybe 100 yards away. The Madison thing collapsed. Not gently. She simply folded, her joints giving out all at once. Christopher lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. She was solid, warm, human. Her pulse fluttered against his fingers like a trapped bird. "Madison?" he said. "Madison, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. Brown eyes, clear and focused, with no trace of that layered chorus. "What? Where?" She blinked, disoriented. "How long was I?" 14 hours, Christopher said. "You're safe now. I've got you." His team burst into the clearing. 3 rangers, 2 volunteers, all of them muddy and exhausted. They surrounded Madison, checking vitals, offering water, wrapping her in an emergency blanket. Christopher stepped back, letting them work, and looked around the clearing. The shapes were gone. The voices silent. In the filtered afternoon light, the ravine looked like any other part of the Hoh rainforest. Ancient, indifferent, beautiful. But Christopher noticed details others might miss. The way certain trees grew in almost perfect circles. The depressions in the earth, long filled in but still visible if you knew what to look for. The remnants of wooden posts, rotted and overgrown, that had once marked the boundaries of Camp Whispering Pines. "Hayes," one of his colleagues said, "your GPS working? Mine's been haywire all day." Christopher pulled out his device. The coordinates now read correctly. N47.8575 Dower, W123.9328 Grown. Right where he should be, right where the ravine opened its mouth to the sky. "Working fine now," he said. They carried Madison out on a stretcher, even though she insisted she could walk. Protocol. She'd been missing for 14 hours in temperatures that dipped into the 40s, with no food and minimal water. Hypothermia was a real concern. Never mind that she seemed remarkably unharmed. As they hiked toward the main trail, Madison reached out and caught Christopher's sleeve. "I heard them," she whispered. "The children. They were singing, and they told me." "Don't," Christopher said gently. "Don't try to make sense of it right now. Just focus on getting warm and safe." "They told me they were tired of singing," Madison continued, her voice barely audible. "They said maybe now they could rest." Christopher looked back at the ravine, disappearing into mist behind them. He thought about the hikers from 2006, never found, and wondered if they'd hear those voices again. He thought about all the unexplained disappearances in this forest, stretching back decades, and how many might be connected to that single tragedy in 1987. But mostly, he thought about what the voices had said. The forest keeps what it takes. And how maybe just this once it had let something go. The sun broke through the canopy as they reached the Hi-Ho Trail, warm and solid and real. Madison was crying quietly, tears cutting tracks through the mud on her face. The medical team would attribute it to shock, to trauma, to the very human response to survival after crisis. Christopher knew better. Sometimes the forest gives you back, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes you carry what happened in those shadows for the rest of your life, wondering which version of events was real, the one that made sense, or the one you lived through. Christopher filed his report that evening, keeping it factual and clean. Subject Madison Porter located at coordinates N47, Toit, 575 degree, W 123.932 degree at 15:23 hours, disoriented but uninjured, likely suffering from exhaustion and hypothermia-induced confusion. Recommended medical evaluation and psychological support. No indication of foul play. Equipment failure likely due to moisture damage. He didn't mention the singing. He didn't mention the voices that knew his name. He didn't mention how his GPS had insisted he was standing in the grave of 27 people, or how Madison's eyes had gone white when she spoke with borrowed mouths. Some things didn't belong in official reports. Some things belonged only in the space between what happened and what could be proven, where belief and doubt tangled like roots in dark soil. That night, lying in his ranger station bunk, Christopher listened to the forest outside his window. The usual sounds, wind through Douglas fir, the distant call of a spotted owl, rain beginning to fall. No singing, no voices. But he knew they were still there, would always be there, waiting in the ravine where tragedy had planted them so many years ago. And he knew that next time someone went missing in that part of the forest, because there would be a next time, there always was, he'd have to make the same choice, acknowledge what he knew to be true, or cling to the comfortable lie that the wilderness was merely indifferent, not hungry. Christopher closed his eyes and tried not to hear the faint echo of Kumbaya drifting through the rain. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of what really happened to Madison during those 14 hours? Were the voices real, or was Christopher's trauma manifesting in the search? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The frozen lake stretched before Christopher Dalton like a sheet of frosted glass, and somewhere beneath 3 feet of February ice lay what was left of Amanda Reeves. Chris exhaled into his gloved hands, watching his breath crystallize in the -20 air. 22 years as a forensic investigator for the National Park Service, and he'd never lost someone to the cold like this. Rangers knew the risks. They respected the wilderness. Amanda Reeves had been one of the best. The Voyageurs National Park Superintendent, a weathered man named Burke, stood beside the ice fishing shelter that served as their makeshift command post. The Kabetogama Peninsula Ranger Station reported her missing 4 days ago, Burke said, his voice tight. She was checking on reports of unusual activity near Black Bay. Hunters seeing things that didn't make sense. What kind of things? Chris asked, photographing the shoreline. The professional in him noted the details. Undisturbed snow, no tracks leading to or from the lake's edge, the peculiar absence of animal prints in an area that should have been rich with winter wildlife. Burke shifted uncomfortably. Tracks, big ones, and sounds at night. The Ojibwe community on the reservation won't come out here anymore. They say the Wendigo walks when the ice is thick. Chris had heard the legends before. The Algonquian myth of the cannibal spirit that possessed those who resorted to eating human flesh during harsh winters. Anthropologically fascinating, forensically irrelevant. Show me where you found her gear. The snowmobile ride took them 2 miles into the forest, through corridors of skeletal birch and dense spruce that seemed to swallow sound. Chris's rational mind cataloged the environment. Boreal forest ecosystem, average snowfall, temperature inversion creating the eerie silence. Nothing supernatural about it. Just physics and geography conspiring to make a man feel small. Amanda's ranger station appeared through the trees like a cabin from a nightmare. The door hung open. Snow drifted across the threshold in wind-sculpted waves. But it was the scratches that made Chris pause. Deep gouges raked down the exterior wall, splintering the wood in parallel lines that suggested claws. Except the mark started 12 feet up. "Bear?" Burke offered, but his voice held no conviction. Chris measured the scratches with his forensic ruler, photographed them from multiple angles. The spacing was wrong for bear claws. Too far apart, too deep, too deliberate. They formed a pattern, almost like tally marks. He counted them. 13 sets of 4, 52 scratches total. Inside, the station was chaos frozen in time. Amanda's breakfast remained on the table, coffee crystallized in her mug. Her radio lay shattered on the floor, its casing cracked open as if crushed by immense pressure. But most disturbing was the journal. Chris found it beneath an overturned chair, its pages stiff with cold. Amanda's handwriting started neat and professional. Routine patrol notes, weather observations, wildlife counts. Then 3 weeks before her disappearance, the entries changed. February 2nd, heard something calling from the forest last night. Almost sounded like words, but in a language I don't know. The Ojibwe elder, Joseph Whitedeer, came by today. Warned me to stay inside after dark. Says the Wendigo is hungry this winter. Told me not to dismiss the old stories. February 7th, found deer carcasses near Cranberry Creek. Something ate them, but not like any predator I've studied. The bones were cracked open, marrow gone. Everything consumed except the hooves and antlers. No tracks anywhere near the kills. February 12th. I'm hearing it every night now. That voice in the forest. It knows my name. How does it know my name? Burke thinks I'm losing it. Maybe I am. But I found something today that I can't explain. A circle of stones near Little Trout Lake, arranged in a pattern. Inside the circle, symbols carved into the frozen ground. Joseph says they're from the old medicine ways, but corrupted. Someone's been doing ceremonies they shouldn't. Chris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He photographed every page, his scientific training warring with an uncomfortable sensation creeping up his spine. Amanda had been rational, experienced, not prone to flights of fancy. February 16th. It's not a legend. I saw it tonight. God help me, I saw it. Tall as the trees, skeletal, with eyes like frozen stars. It moved wrong, like it was learning how to be in our world. The hunger in its stare. I felt it in my bones. It wanted to consume me, not just physically, but utterly. I'm leaving tomorrow. I don't care if they think I'm crazy. This place is wrong. That was the last entry, 2 days before she disappeared. I need to see this stone circle, Chris said. Burke shook his head. It'll be dark in 2 hours. We should head back. Then we leave early tomorrow. Chris pocketed the journal, but his hand trembled slightly as he did. Just the cold, he told himself. Just the cold. That night in the small cabin the Park Service maintained for visiting investigators, Chris couldn't sleep. He laid out Amanda's journal, his photographs, his measurements, trying to construct a rational narrative. Someone had been harassing Amanda. The symbols were likely graffiti from teenagers playing with Native American imagery they didn't understand. The scratches could be explained by what? A tall ladder and a garden rake? At 2:47 a.m., he heard it. A voice, distant but distinct, calling through the forest. It sounded almost human, but the words were wrong, stretched and distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. Chris pressed his face to the frosted window, breath fogging the glass. The forest stood silent under a gibbous moon, shadows pooling between the trees like spilled ink. Then he saw movement. Something tall and impossibly thin, gliding between the birches with a gait that defied anatomy. It moved in stuttering motions, as if it existed only in discrete moments, teleporting forward in jerky increments. Chris grabbed his camera, hands shaking, but by the time he raised it, the figure had vanished. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning brought Burke and a local Ojibwe guide named Thomas Whitedeer, nephew of the elder Amanda had mentioned. Thomas was young, maybe 30, but his eyes held ancient wariness. "You saw it last night," he said. Not a question. "I saw something," Chris replied carefully. "Probably a trick of moonlight." "The Weendigo doesn't play tricks," Thomas said flatly. "It hunts. It hungers. And once it knows you're here, it won't stop." They snowmobiled to Little Trout Lake in silence. The stone circle was exactly as Amanda had described. 17 stones arranged in a spiral pattern, each carved with symbols that made Chris's eyes hurt to look at directly. Inside the circle, the snow had been carefully cleared away, revealing symbols etched into the frozen ground. Not Native American, Chris realized, or at least not traditional. These were hybrid symbols, mixing Ojibwe pictographs with what looked like bastardized European occult imagery. "Someone's been trying to call something," Thomas said, voice tight with anger. "Using our medicine ways wrong. Mixing them with Wendigo lore, with things that should never be mixed. This is desecration." Chris photographed everything, measuring, documenting, building his case. There had to be a rational explanation. Cult activity, maybe. Some group playing with symbols they didn't understand, using Amanda's fear against her. Then Burke called out from the tree line. "Chris, you need to see this." The tracks started at the circle's edge and led into the forest, but calling them tracks seemed inadequate. They were impressions in the snow, each one 8 feet from the last, shaped like elongated human footprints but twice the size. And they were fresh, made sometime in the last few hours. Chris followed them, camera in hand, Burke and Thomas trailing behind. The tracks led deeper into the forest, winding between trees too close together for anything of the suggested size to pass through. Yet the tracks continued, impossible and undeniable. They found the first body half a mile in. It had been a white-tailed deer, possibly yesterday. Now it was scattered across 30 feet of blood-stained snow, bones cracked open with surgical precision, every scrap of meat and marrow consumed. But it was the arrangement that made Chris's stomach turn. The bones had been carefully positioned in a pattern, forming symbols similar to those in the stone circle. "It's leaving us messages," Thomas whispered. "Showing us what it does, what it is." Chris forced himself to photograph the scene, to document the evidence even as his rational worldview began developing stress fractures. The marrow had been extracted from bones that should have required industrial equipment to break. The precision of the consumption suggested intelligence, purpose, not animal instinct. They found the second body another quarter-mile deeper. This one had been human. Chris's training kicked in automatically. Document, photograph, preserve the scene. But his hands shook as he worked. The body, what remained of it, lay in the center of another stone circle, this one smaller, cruder. The victim had been male, maybe 40, dressed in hunting gear. His hunting license, still in his pocket, identified him as Marcus Webb, reported missing 3 weeks ago. The consumption pattern was identical to the deer. Every ounce of soft tissue gone, bones cracked open, arranged in that same deliberate pattern. But worse, far worse, were the marks on the skeleton. Deep grooves in the bones themselves, as if they'd been gnawed by teeth that could bite through calcium like butter. "This isn't animal predation," Chris heard himself say. His voice sounded distant, detached. I don't know what this is." "Yes, you do," Thomas said quietly. "You just don't want to believe it." The sun was setting, shadows growing long between the trees. Burke pulled out his radio. "We need to call this in. Get a full forensic team out here, FBI maybe." The radio died with a crackle of static. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had opened a door to absolute zero. Chris's breath came out in clouds so thick he could barely see through them. Frost spread across his goggles in fractal patterns, and then they heard it, the voice from the forest, calling. Christopher, Burke, Thomas. It knew their names. All their names. "Run!" Thomas screamed. They ran. Behind them, the forest came alive with the sound of splintering trees. Chris risked one glance back and immediately wished he hadn't. Something moved through the twilight woods, tall as the pines, skeletal and wrong, with limbs that bent in too many places. Its head was the skull of something that might have been a deer once, but stretched and warped into a grotesque hybrid of human and animal. And its eyes, God, its eyes, burned with a hunger that transcended physical need. Chris's snowmobile roared to life, and he gunned it without waiting for the others. Primal terror had seized his rational mind, reducing him to pure survival instinct. Trees blurred past. Behind him he heard Burke screaming, then the scream cutting off abruptly in a wet, tearing sound. Thomas pulled alongside him, face pale with terror. "The lake!" he shouted. "It won't cross running water." They burst from the forest onto the frozen expanse of Kabetogama Lake. Chris's scientific mind, even in its panicked state, noted the irony. Frozen water wasn't running water. But Thomas seemed certain, and certainty was all they had left. The thing that had been pursuing them stopped at the forest's edge. In the dying light, Chris could see it clearly now, and the sight threatened to shatter what remained of his sanity. It stood at least 15 feet tall, its body a nightmare of stretched skin barely containing an impossible skeletal frame. Its fingers ended in claws of yellow bone, and when it opened its mouth, Chris saw rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's maw, not anything terrestrial. But most horrifying was its face. Beneath the deer skull that crowned its head, Chris could see fragments of human features twisted and distorted, and in those features he recognized Amanda Reeves. "No," he whispered. "No, that's impossible." The Wendigo, because that's what it was, Chris could no longer deny it, tilted its head in a gesture that was almost curious. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of screaming winds and grinding bones. "She was so hungry, Christopher. Lost in the storm, desperate, found Marcus Webb's cabin, found what was left of his supplies, found what was left of Marcus." "She wouldn't," Chris said. But even as he spoke, he remembered the journal entries, Amanda's growing isolation, her fear, the terrible cold of that record-breaking winter. "One bite," the Wendigo continued, and now Chris could hear Amanda's voice threaded through the supernatural cacophony. "Just one bite to survive, but the hunger never stops. It grows and grows until there's nothing left but the need to consume. I tried to warn you, Chris, in my journal, but you didn't listen. You never listened to the old stories." Thomas grabbed Chris's arm. "We have to go, now, while it's still talking." But Chris couldn't move. He was transfixed by the creature that had been his colleague, his friend. "There has to be a way to help her. Some kind of treatment, There is no help for the Wendigo," the creature said. And now it stepped onto the ice. The frozen lake groaned under its weight, but held. "There is only hunger. And you, Christopher, with your rational mind and your scientific explanations, you would make such a delicious addition to what I am becoming." It charged. The world became chaos. Thomas's snowmobile screamed to life, and Chris followed on instinct alone. The ice cracked behind them with sounds like cannon fire. Chris glanced back and saw the Wendigo running across the lake with impossible speed, its body flickering in and out of reality, as if it existed only partially in their world. They were halfway across the lake when Chris's snowmobile hit a pressure ridge and launched into the air. He landed hard, felt something crack in his ribs, but adrenaline kept him moving. The snowmobile sputtered and died. Thomas circled back, pulling alongside. "Get on." Chris jumped onto the back of Thomas's machine just as the Wendigo closed to within 50 feet. He could feel the cold radiating from it, a supernatural chill that burned worse than any natural frost. His exposed skin began to blister with frostbite. The ranger station appeared ahead, lights blazing. Thomas drove straight into the station's garage, and they slammed the door shut behind them. Through the small window, Chris watched the Wendigo stop at the building's perimeter, pacing back and forth like a caged predator. "Why isn't it coming in?" Chris gasped, his rational mind still struggling to understand the rules of this nightmare. "This station was blessed," Thomas said, pulling out his phone. "My uncle performed ceremonies here when it was built. Traditional protections. But they won't last forever. Not against something this strong." He dialed, waited. "Uncle Joseph? It's Thomas. We need help. The Wendigo. Yes, it's Amanda. It's already taken Burke. Yes, okay. He hung up. "My uncle is coming. He says there's one way to stop a Wendigo, but..." Thomas swallowed hard. "We have to kill what it used to be. Completely. Fire is the only way." Chris thought of Amanda, brilliant and dedicated, reduced to a monster of endless hunger. His scientific worldview had been shredded, replaced by a new understanding of the world's terrible depths. "How long do we have?" "Until the protections fail. Could be an hour, could be less." Outside, the Wendigo began to sing. It was a haunting melody, something ancient and cold, words in a language that predated human civilization. Chris recognized fragments from Amanda's journal, the calls she'd heard in the forest. The creature was using her knowledge, her memories, trying to break through the protective barriers. An hour passed. Then 2. The Wendigo never stopped singing, never stopped pacing. Chris watched it through the window, studying it with the same methodical attention he'd once brought to crime scenes. He documented its movements, its vocalizations, the way frost spread across surfaces wherever it drew near. Even now, even terrified, he was still an investigator. It was all he had left. Joseph Whitedeer arrived at dawn, a small, ancient man who moved with surprising speed across the snow. He carried a bundle of cedar and sage, and something wrapped in leather that Chris suspected was a weapon. The elder entered the station and immediately began preparing a ritual. He drew symbols on the floor with ash, symbols that matched those in the stone circles but arranged differently, protective rather than summoning. The one who called the Wendigo used corrupted magic, Joseph said as he worked, mixed traditions that should never be mixed, created a doorway for the hunger spirit to enter our world. When your friend consumed human flesh, even in desperation, she opened herself to possession. "Can we save her?" Chris asked. Though he already knew the answer. "What was Amanda Reeves is gone," Joseph said gently. "Only the hunger remains. But we can free her spirit and close the doorway. It will require sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Joseph looked at Chris with eyes that had seen too much. "The creature is drawn to you. It wants your knowledge, your rational mind. It will come for you specifically. We need to use you as bait." Chris laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course. The skeptic becomes the sacrifice. There's a terrible poetry in that." They prepared as the sun climbed higher. Joseph explained the plan. Chris would step outside the protection, drawing the Wendigo close. When it was fully committed to the attack, Thomas and Joseph would ignite a barrier of sacred fire, trapping it long enough for Joseph to perform the banishment ritual. "If it goes wrong?" Chris asked. "Then you become what she became," Joseph said simply. Chris thought about refusing. Every rational instinct screamed at him to find another way, to call for help, to let someone else handle this nightmare. But Burke was dead. Amanda was gone. And he was the one who hadn't listened to the warnings, who had dismissed the old stories as superstition. He stepped outside at noon when the sun was highest and the shadows shortest. The Wendigo was waiting. It stood at the forest's edge, patient and eternal. When it saw Chris, it made a sound that might have been Amanda's laughter, distorted into something hideous. Then it charged. Chris forced himself to stand still as the creature closed the distance. 50 feet, 40, 30. He could see the details now, the way its skin stretched over impossible anatomy, the human teeth mixed with fangs in its jaws, the frozen tears crystallized on its cheeks. Some part of Amanda was still in there, trapped and suffering. 20 feet. Joseph and Thomas emerged from the station, spreading the circle of sage and cedar around the creature's path. 10 feet. Chris could smell it now, not decay, but something worse. The absence of smell, a void that consumed even odor. 5 feet. The Wendigo reached out with claws that could disembowel him with a casual swipe. Joseph spoke words in Ojibwe, old words, powerful words. The sage and cedar burst into flames, creating a wall of sacred fire. The Wendigo screamed, a sound that shattered the ice on the nearby lake and sent snow cascading from tree branches 100 yards away. Chris stumbled backward, falling into the snow. The creature thrashed against the fire barrier, but the flames held. Joseph continued his chant, voice growing stronger, and Thomas added his voice to the ritual. The Wendigo's form began to waver, becoming translucent. Through its body, Chris could see the forest beyond. It turned its terrible gaze on him one last time, and for just a moment he saw Amanda's eyes looking out at him. Human, pleading. "I'm sorry," Chris whispered. "I should have listened." Joseph thrust his hands forward, and the flames surged inward, consuming the Wendigo entirely. Its screams gradually faded, replaced by a sound like wind through empty spaces. The fire burned with unnatural intensity, leaving no smoke, no ash, just a circle of scorched earth where the creature had been trapped. When the flames finally died, nothing remained. No body, no bones, nothing. Just the lingering smell of cedar and the echo of ancient words. Chris sat in the snow, shaking. Thomas helped him up, and together they returned to the station. Joseph was already dismantling the stone circles, erasing the corrupted symbols, purifying the desecrated ground. "Who did this?" Chris asked. "Who called the Wendigo?" "We may never know," Joseph said. "Someone foolish enough to play with forces they didn't understand. Someone who thought the old stories were just entertainment." He looked at Chris meaningfully. "The Wendigo is always waiting, at the edges of civilization in the hungry times. Your friend was unlucky, desperate, but the doorway was already open. The calling had already been done." 3 days later, Chris submitted his report to the National Park Service. He documented Burke's death as a wildlife attack. There were enough bear tracks in the area to make it plausible. Amanda Reeves remained missing, presumed dead, lost to the wilderness. Marcus Webb's body was found and returned to his family with explanations of animal predation. The true story, the real horror, Chris kept locked in a private journal. Who would believe it? He barely believed it himself. Despite having lived through it, the rational part of his mind still tried to find explanations. Shared psychosis, environmental toxins, mass hysteria. But on cold nights, when the wind howled through the trees, Chris knew the truth. The old stories weren't just stories. The hunger that walks was real, waiting in the wilderness, patient and eternal. He never returned to Voyageurs National Park. Some knowledge once gained could never be forgotten, and some terrors once witnessed hollowed you out from the inside, leaving a hunger of a different kind. The desperate need to forget what you knew was true. The Wendigo was gone, but the winter was long, and people got desperate. Somewhere in some frozen forest, the hunger would walk again. It always did. And next time, maybe there wouldn't be anyone left who remembered the old stories, who knew the protections, who could stop it before it consumed everything. Chris kept Joseph Whitedeer's phone number in his wallet just in case, because now he understood. The rational world and the supernatural world weren't separate. They never had been. The horror was that they occupied the same space, and most people never noticed until it was too late. Until the hunger found them, until they heard their name called from the darkness, until they understood with terrible clarity that some things in the wilderness should never be dismissed as legend. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The frozen breath hung in the air like a warning Will Carter chose to ignore. February on Isle Royale meant the national park existed in a state of suspended animation, locked in ice, cut off from the mainland by the frozen expanse of Lake Superior, accessible only by bush plane or snowmobile across the treacherous ice road. Most sensible people avoided the island entirely during winter. Most sensible people weren't FBI forensic analysts tracking a missing persons case that had already gone cold in every sense of the word. Will pulled his parka tighter as he stood outside the ranger station, studying the map Park Ranger Davis had spread across the hood of the snow-covered pickup. At 42, Will had seen enough crime scenes to trust exactly two things: physical evidence and the scientific method. Everything else was noise. Harper Martinez was last seen here, Davis said, tapping a gloved finger on the map near Rock Harbor. January 15th, 3 weeks ago, she was doing her graduate research on wolfpack behavior. Experienced winter camper, knew the island well. She'd been here since November. And you didn't report her missing until last week? Will kept his voice neutral, professional. No judgment, just facts. Davis's jaw tightened. Her check-ins were weekly. We assumed equipment failure when we didn't hear from her. Happens all the time out here. The cold kills batteries, ice storms take down what little cell reception we have. By the time we got a team to her last known camp, he trailed off, and something in his expression made Will look up from the map. What did you find? Nothing. And I mean nothing. Tent was gone. Equipment was gone. Like she'd never been there at all. Davis paused, his breath coming faster. Except for the trees. The trees? You need to see it yourself. 20 minutes later, Will stood in a clearing that shouldn't exist. He'd reviewed the satellite imagery from November. This had been dense boreal forest, white spruce and birch packed tight. Now, a perfect circle of trees had been stripped bare, not cut or burned, but peeled. Bark hung in long, deliberate strips, and carved into the exposed wood were symbols that made Will's forensic mind stumble. He pulled out his camera, photographing each tree methodically. The symbols were deep, deliberate, repeated with obsessive precision. Not random scratches, not bear marks. Deliberate carving that would have taken hours, days even. And they were fresh. The exposed wood showed no weathering despite 3 weeks of sub-zero temperatures. We brought in a cultural consultant from the Grand Portage Band, Davis said quietly. He took one look and left. Wouldn't say why. Just said we should leave the island. What are these symbols? Will asked, though he was already pulling out his satellite phone to photograph and send images to the FBI's database. Old warnings. Ojibwe, he said. Boundary markers for places humans aren't supposed to go. Davis's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. He said the word Wendigo and then refused to speak English, just kept repeating something in Ojibwe until he was back on his snowmobile. Will didn't believe in curses or spirits or anything that couldn't be measured, tested, replicated. But he believed in human behavior, and someone had carved these symbols with purpose. Someone had taken Harper Martinez. The supernatural veneer was just that, a veneer over human violence. It always was. Show me where her camp was supposed to be. They snowmobiled deeper into the island's interior, following GPS coordinates that Harper had transmitted in her last check-in. The forest pressed close, and Will found himself noticing things his rational mind wanted to dismiss. The absolute silence. No birds, no wind. Nothing but the mechanical roar of their engines. The way shadows seemed to stretch wrong in the flat winter light. The sensation of being watched that prickled at the base of his skull. When they reached the coordinates, Davis killed his engine, and the silence rushed in like water filling a grave. Harper's camp wasn't gone. It had been destroyed with methodical precision. The tent had been shredded into strips that hung from branches like prayer flags. Her equipment was arranged in concentric circles around a central point. Sleeping bag, camp stove, water bottles, research notes, all placed with geometric precision. At the center was a flat stone, and on the stone was something that made Will's forensic training catch and stutter. It was a hand, just a hand, cut cleanly at the wrist, frozen solid, fingers extended upward like a grotesque supplication. Will approached slowly, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He'd seen bodies before, seen what humans could do to each other, but something about this was wrong. The cut was too clean. No tearing, no saw marks, no evidence of tools. The flesh looked almost burned where it separated from bone. Cauterized instantly, he pulled out an evidence bag, preparing to collect the hand when he noticed the fingers. They'd been carved with the same symbols as the trees. Deep cuts that should have bled profusely but showed no blood at all, just exposed flesh that looked frost-burned and ancient. "We need to get this to the mainland," Will said, forcing his voice steady. "And we need to search the entire area. If someone took her, there's evidence. There's always evidence." But even as he said it, his eyes tracked the snow around the camp. No footprints except their own. No signs of struggle. No blood trail. Just the arranged equipment and the severed hand, and the overwhelming sense that something was watching from between the trees. They worked until darkness came, which in February at this latitude meant late afternoon. Will documented everything, collected samples, mapped the scene with the precision that had made him one of the FBI's best forensic analysts. Every piece of physical evidence would tell a story. It always did. Back at the ranger station, Will spread his findings across a table and began the methodical process of analysis. The hand, Harper's hand, confirmed by fingerprints, showed signs of extreme frostbite that predated the amputation. The symbols carved into the fingers matched the ones on the trees, and when he cross-referenced them with the FBI's database of gang markings, cult symbols, and known criminal signatures, he found nothing. It was Davis who provided the translation, pulling out a worn book from the station's small library. "My predecessor left this, Guide to Ojibwe Culture and Language of the Lake Superior Region." Will took the book, finding pages marked with old sticky notes. The symbols weren't exact matches, but they were close enough. Boundary markers, like Davis had said, warnings, and one phrase repeated across several translations: "The place where hunger walks." "We indigo," Will read aloud, his voice flat. "Wendigo, a malevolent spirit of insatiable hunger, created when a human resorts to cannibalism, transforming into a creature of..." He stopped reading, closed the book. "It's mythology. Someone staging this to look supernatural." "Is it?" Davis asked, and there was something haunted in his eyes. "Because there's something I didn't tell you. Harper wasn't the first." The files Davis showed him went back 60 years. Disappearances on Isle Royale followed a pattern. Every decade or so, someone vanished during winter. Always experienced outdoors people, always in the interior, and always the same elements: stripped trees, arranged belongings, and in the older cases before modern forensics, references to the hunger and walking bones in witness statements. "The Park Service suppressed these?" Will asked, flipping through incident reports that showed clear evidence of institutional cover-up. "The island survives on tourism. Can't have stories about monsters eating visitors." Davis laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Besides, what were we supposed to say? That something out there has been taking people for generations? That the Ojibwe won't come to the interior anymore because they know something walks here that shouldn't?" Will's rational mind rejected it all, but his forensic training couldn't ignore the pattern. Patterns meant evidence. Evidence meant answers. "I need to go back out there, tomorrow. There's something we're missing." That night, alone in the small bunkhouse the Park Service provided, Will reviewed his photographs on his laptop. The battery was dying. The cold sapped electronics faster than he'd anticipated, but he had enough power to examine the images in detail. That's when he saw it. In one photo, taken at dusk, something stood between the trees behind the arranged campsite. The figure was wrong, too tall, too thin, proportions that didn't match human anatomy. In the low resolution and failing light, it looked almost skeletal. But the head... Will enlarged the image until it pixelated. The head was massive, crowned with what looked like antlers, but antlers that branched wrong, that seemed to grow through the skull rather than from it, and the eyes, just visible in the shadow, caught the camera flash in a way that made them glow with reflected light. He checked the metadata. The timestamp placed it during his investigation, which meant he'd been photographed. He'd been watched. And whatever had watched him had stood close enough to be captured in frame. Will's hand shook as he went through the other images. It was in 7 more photos, always at the edge of frame, always partially obscured. In one image, it was much closer, close enough that he could see details that made his forensic mind rebel against what his eyes reported. The skin looked burned, stretched too tight over bones that protruded at unnatural angles. The mouth opened too wide, showing teeth that had been filed to points, and the hands, if they could be called hands, ended in fingers that were too long, tipped with what looked like blackened bone. His laptop died, plunging the bunkhouse into darkness. Will sat in the silence, listening to his own heartbeat, trying to apply logic to what he'd seen. Someone in a costume. Had to be. Someone using the mythology to disguise their crimes. That was the only explanation that made sense. But the height, the proportions, and the way it had moved between frames, covering distances that should have been impossible in the time between shots. Human behavior. That's what he understood. And humans did terrible things, wore terrible masks, perpetuated terrible violence. The supernatural was just window dressing. He almost believed it. The next morning brought a storm that Davis said would ground the bush plane for at least 3 days. Will was trapped on the island, which meant he had time to conduct a thorough investigation. He requisitioned a snowmobile and, against Davis's increasingly frantic objections, headed back into the interior. The symbols on the trees were his focus. If he could understand the pattern, he could understand the perpetrator. He spent hours photographing and mapping them, creating a geographic profile that showed the symbols formed concentric rings expanding outward from a central point deeper in the forest. Whoever had taken Harper, he corrected himself, was operating from a home base. Find the base, find the evidence, find the evidence, find the truth. By noon, he'd reached the center of the symbol pattern. The trees here were ancient, towering white pines that predated European settlement. And carved into their trunks, 10 feet up, were more symbols. Not warnings this time, but something else. Something that looked almost like a story told in pictographs. Will photographed them, his neck craning to capture the highest carvings. That's when he saw the cave. It wasn't marked on any map. A fissure in the rocky hillside, partially concealed by snow and fallen timber. But the snow around the entrance had been disturbed recently, and when Will approached, he saw something that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Bones, piled at the cave entrance in a deliberate arrangement. Animal bones mostly. Wolf skulls, deer rib cages, small mammals. But among them, unmistakably human remains. A femur, several vertebrae, and propped against a rock like a macabre welcome sign, a human skull that still had frozen flesh clinging to it. Will's training took over. He documented everything, collected samples, examined the scene with clinical precision. The human remains showed signs of having been gnawed, but the tooth marks were wrong, too large, too deep, and the bones had been cracked to access the marrow with a force that suggested industrial equipment or impossible strength. The cave entrance beckoned. Every instinct screamed at him to wait, to call for backup, to approach this rationally and safely. But the storm was worsening, visibility dropping, and if Harper was somewhere in that cave, if any part of her could still be found, he had to know. He clicked on his flashlight and entered. The cave was narrow at first, forcing him to squeeze through passages that scraped his parka. Then it opened into a chamber that his flashlight couldn't fully illuminate. The smell hit him immediately. Decay and something else. Something sharp and chemical that burned his nostrils. His light caught carvings on every surface. The same symbols repeated thousands of times, overlapping and intersecting in patterns that seemed to move in his peripheral vision. And in the center of the chamber, a throne made of bones. Human bones. Arranged with architectural precision into a seat that rose 8 feet high. Skulls formed the base, femurs and tibias the supports, rib cages woven into a backrest. And seated on the throne was what remained of Harper Martinez. Will's flashlight shook as he approached. Harper's body had been posed, her remaining hand placed on the arm of the throne, her head tilted back as if in ecstasy or agony. Her torso had been opened from sternum to pelvis, organs removed with surgical precision. But unlike any crime scene Will had ever encountered, there was no blood. The body had been drained completely, flesh gray and desiccated like something mummified. Carved into her chest, the same symbols, and arranged around the throne, her organs, each one placed in a small stone bowl. Heart, liver, lungs, stomach, all present, all arranged with ritualistic care. Will's rational mind fractured. This wasn't human. Couldn't be human. The precision, the lack of blood, the ritualistic elements that went beyond any serial killer's signature he'd ever studied. This was something else, something his education and experience hadn't prepared him for. A sound echoed from deeper in the cave. Not human, a clicking, rattling sound like bones tapping together. And beneath it, something that might have been breathing or might have been words in a language that hurt to hear. Will ran. Professional training abandoned, evidence forgotten. He ran back through the narrow passages, scraping his hands raw on the stone, his flashlight bouncing wildly. Behind him, the clicking grew louder, closer, accompanied by a stench that overwhelmed even the cave's decay. He burst from the cave entrance into the storm, snow blinding him immediately. His snowmobile was where he'd left it, and he had never been more grateful for modern machinery in his life. The engine roared to life, and he didn't look back as he accelerated into the whiteout conditions. But he felt it behind him, felt something keeping pace with his snowmobile, moving through the forest with impossible speed. In his peripheral vision, he caught glimpses of something tall and skeletal, antlers scraping against tree branches, eyes that glowed in the storm's darkness. The symbols on the trees blurred past, and Will understood with sudden, terrible clarity that they weren't warnings. They were boundaries. And he had crossed them. He had entered the space where hunger walked. And now hunger was following him home. The ranger station appeared through the snow like a mirage. Will abandoned the snowmobile, stumbling through the door and slamming it behind him. Davis looked up from the radio, took one look at Will's face and reached for the rifle mounted on the wall. "You saw it," Davis said. It wasn't a question. Will nodded, gasping for breath. "Harper's dead, in a cave. There's something. I don't know what it is, but it's..." The window shattered. What came through wasn't human. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, body emaciated to the point of skeletal visibility. Skin burned black and stretched tight over bones that protruded at angles that defied anatomy. The antlers rose from its skull, growing through and around the cranium in a crown of blackened bone. And its mouth opened impossibly wide, showing rows of teeth filed to points, a tongue that was too long and too black. Davis fired. The bullet struck center mass, and the creature didn't even flinch. It moved with fluid speed, crossing the room in a heartbeat, one elongated hand wrapping around Davis's throat. The ranger's scream cut off as the creature lifted him effortlessly, its jaw unhinging wider, impossibly wide. Will grabbed the radio, screaming for help into the handset even as he watched the creature bite into Davis's shoulder. The sound was wet and terrible, bones crunching, flesh tearing. But worse was the sound the creature made, a moan of pleasure or relief, a sound that was almost human in its gratitude. The radio squawked back. 3 days until the storm cleared. 3 days until help could arrive. Will ran. Through the back door, into the storm, without supplies or plan or hope. Behind him, the creature fed, and the sounds would haunt whatever remained of his life. He ran into the white, into the cold, into the forest where hunger walked eternal. The symbols on the trees guided him without his conscious choice. His forensic mind, shattered but still functioning on some base level, recognized the pattern, the boundaries, the warnings the Ojibwe had carved generations ago, trying to contain something that couldn't be killed, only avoided. He understood now, understood the disappearances, the pattern, the decade-long cycles. The creature, the Wendigo, he could accept the word now, wasn't hunting. It was feeding only when it had to, taking just enough to sustain itself, constrained by the boundaries humans had carved in desperate hope. And he had broken those boundaries. He had entered its sacred space, disturbed its ritual, seen its throne. He had violated the taboo, and now the consequences would spread beyond the island, beyond containment. Will found himself back at the circle of stripped trees, Harper's destroyed camp. The symbols carved into the bark seemed to glow in the storm's darkness, pulsing with a light that had no source. And standing in the center, waiting, was the Wendigo. It didn't attack. Instead, it watched him with eyes that held terrible intelligence. It gestured with one elongated hand toward the trees, toward the symbols, and Will understood. The boundaries had been broken. New ones had to be established, and the price for crossing them was always the same. The creature's mouth moved and sounds emerged that might have been words in Ojibwe, in a dialect older than the island, older than the forest. Will didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The hunger was eternal. The feeding was inevitable. And those who crossed the boundaries became part of the cycle. His satellite phone, forgotten in his pocket, buzzed. A single bar of service, a miracle in the storm. He pulled it out with numb fingers, saw messages from the FBI field office, from his wife, from his daughter. Normal life, waiting on the mainland. A life he would never return to. The Wendigo stepped closer, and Will saw the symbols carved into its burned flesh. The same symbols on the trees, on Harper's fingers, on the cave walls. Markers of transformation, of crossing boundaries that should never be crossed. Of hunger that consumed not just flesh, but humanity itself. The phone slipped from his fingers into the snow. Will Carter, FBI forensic analyst, man of science and evidence, stood in the storm and understood that some things existed beyond measurement, beyond explanation, beyond the rational world he'd spent his life defending. The creature reached for him with hands that ended in blackened bone, and Will closed his eyes. The last thought that crossed his mind before the transformation began was that patterns always meant something. Evidence always told a story. He just hadn't understood that this time he was going to become part of the evidence. 3 weeks later, when the storm finally cleared and the rescue team arrived, they found Ranger Davis's body in the station. The medical examiner would note massive trauma consistent with animal attack, though no known animal on the island could have inflicted such damage. They never found Will Carter, just his satellite phone, found in a clearing where the trees had been stripped bare, where new symbols had been carved deep into exposed wood, boundary markers, warnings. The FBI closed the case as a missing person, likely claimed by the island's harsh winter. Harper Martinez was officially declared killed by a bear attack. The cave was never found again, though search teams would later report a strange sensation of dread when approaching that section of the forest, a sense that something watched them from between the trees. Isle Royale National Park remains open to visitors. During summer, tourists hike the trails and photograph the wolves and enjoy the pristine wilderness. The Park Service doesn't mention the winter disappearances anymore. The symbols carved into trees in the interior are attributed to historical logging marks. And every decade or so, someone experienced and confident ventures into the interior during winter. Someone who doesn't believe in old warnings, in boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, in hunger that walks eternal. The pattern continues. The evidence accumulates. And in the silence of the boreal forest, between trees marked with symbols older than America, something waits with infinite patience, because hunger is eternal, and the boundaries exist for a reason. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The call came at 6:47 a.m., shattering the pre-dawn stillness of the ranger station. Christopher Hayes had been awake for 20 minutes, standing at the window with his third cup of coffee, watching fog roll through the Sitka spruce like something alive and searching. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. It always did on mornings like this when the forest felt too quiet. Olympic National Park, Ranger Hayes speaking. "Please." The woman's voice cracked immediately. "Please, you have to find her. My daughter, Madison. She went hiking yesterday on the Hoh River Trail and she never came back. We tried calling, but there's no service and..." A sob interrupted her words. "She promised she'd be back by dinner. She always keeps her promises." Chris pulled a notepad closer, his stomach already tightening into the familiar knot. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down. Tell me your daughter's full name." "Madison Parker. She's 19. Sophomore at University of Washington. She's studying forestry because she loves places like this." The mother's voice steadied slightly, clinging to details like a lifeline. She's experienced. She knows what she's doing out there. They always say that, Chris thought, but kept his voice calm and professional. When exactly did she start her hike? Yesterday morning, around 9, she was staying at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center area. She texted me at 10:15 a.m. saying the forest was beautiful. That was the last time I heard from her. 21 hours. Chris felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. He'd learned to trust that feeling 5 years ago, even when he wished he couldn't. "I'm heading out immediately, Mrs. Parker. I need you to send me any photos of Madison, what she was wearing, any distinguishing features, and I'll need you to forward that last text message." After taking down the additional details, Chris ended the call and stood motionless for a moment, staring at his notes without seeing them. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright, too sterile for what he was about to walk into. Through the window, the fog had thickened, pressing against the glass like dozens of pale hands. He forced himself to move, pulling his gear from the locker with practiced efficiency. Garmin GPS unit, though signal would be spotty past mile 3. First aid kit, comprehensive. SAR beacon, rope. His knife, the fixed blade Benchmate his father had given him. Water purification tablets, emergency bivvy. The list was muscle memory now, but his hand still checked each item twice. The photograph arrived on his phone as he was loading his pack. Madison Parker smiling at the camera, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a red North Face jacket that would be visible from a distance. The kind of girl who looked ready for anything. Chris had seen that confidence before, in the faces of others who'd walked into this forest and found something that confidence couldn't prepare them for. He locked the station and stepped into the morning. The air tasted of rain and decomposition, that sweet rot smell of the temperate rainforest, where everything was simultaneously growing and dying. His truck's engine seemed too loud as he drove the 12 miles to the Hoh Rainforest trailhead, the road unwinding through corridors of moss-draped trees that looked like they'd been waiting for centuries. "Don't think about it," he told himself. "Focus on the search. Standard protocol. She's probably just disoriented, maybe injured. Nothing else." But his hands were shaking again. The Hoh River Trail stretched 18 miles into the heart of the rainforest, climbing gradually toward Blue Glacier on Mount Olympus. Chris had walked it hundreds of times in his 8 years as a ranger, knew every river crossing and campsite, every spot where the trail narrowed and the trees closed in overhead. He'd always loved this place, the way light filtered green through the canopy, the silence that felt full rather than empty. That had been before. He reached the trailhead at 7:43 a.m. and immediately checked the register box. Madison's name was there in neat handwriting. Madison Parker, solo hike to 5 Mile Island Camp, return 9/14/11. Yesterday's date. He photographed the entry and continued to the actual trail. The forest swallowed him within 50 feet. Moss hung from every branch in thick curtains of electric green, and ferns erupted from the forest floor in prehistoric abundance. The path was soft underfoot, carpeted with decomposed needles in last week's rain. Chris moved quickly but carefully, scanning for any sign of passage. A broken branch, a footprint in mud, candy wrapper, anything. At mile marker 2, he found the first indication she'd come this way. A clear boot print in a muddy patch near the river, size 7 or 8. Deep heel mark suggesting a descending step. He photographed it, noted the GPS coordinates, and continued. The trail here ran parallel to the Hoh River, which churned gray-green with glacial melt. The sound of it should have been calming, white noise to mask the forest's smaller sounds. Instead, Chris found himself straining to hear past it, listening for something he couldn't name. By mile 4, the forest had changed in that subtle way it always did. The trees grew larger, more ancient. Spaces between them deepened into shadows that the morning light couldn't penetrate. Chris had learned to recognize the boundary, not a physical marker, but a feeling like walking from a warm room into a cold one. He keyed his radio. "Station, this is Hayes. I'm at mile 4 on Hoh River Trail. No visual contact yet. Trail conditions normal." Static answered him, then broke into fragments of voice. "Copy. Signal. Checking. Repeat, station. You're breaking up. Reported. Other. Trail. The radio went silent. Chris checked the battery. Full charge. He tried again, got only white noise and clipped it back to his belt. Standard for this area. The mountains did strange things to signals. At mile 4.7 he found Madison's first campsite. It was just off trail, tucked between two massive Sitka spruce trees in a small clearing. The forest floor here was relatively dry and someone had clearly spent time arranging stones for a fire ring, though no fire had been lit. A compression mark in the moss suggested where a tent had been pitched. Chris knelt, studying the site. His fingers brushed something caught in the moss, a hair tie, red fabric with white polka dots. He bagged it carefully, then circled the camp, looking for anything else. That's when he noticed the trees. 4 of them, evenly spaced around the clearing's perimeter, had strips of bark torn away at roughly chest height. The exposed wood was pale and fresh, maybe 12 hours old. Chris approached the nearest one, frowning. The marks weren't made by an animal. Too deliberate, too clean. They looked almost like claw marks, but human-sized. He photographed them from multiple angles, his pulse beginning to quicken. The marks were too high for Madison's height, unless she'd been reaching. And why would anyone do this? A sound stopped him mid-thought. A voice, distant but distinct, calling through the trees. Help. Chris spun, his hand dropping instinctively to his knife. Madison? Madison Parker? The forest absorbed his voice. No echo, no response. He strained to hear, holding his breath. It came again, but from a different direction. Please. Help. Wrong. Something about it was wrong. The voice had no depth, no source. It came from everywhere and nowhere, like it was inside the forest itself, rather than traveling through it. This is Ranger Hayes, he called, forcing authority into his voice. If you can hear me, stay where you are. I'm coming to you. He moved toward where he thought the voice had originated, pushing through ferns that left his pants soaked. The moss underfoot grew thicker here, muffling his footsteps until he couldn't hear himself walk. Just the river, distant now, and his breathing too fast. A flash of red ahead. He lunged toward it, branches scraping his face. But it was just a mushroom cluster, Russula emetica, growing from a rotted log. Not a jacket. He steadied himself against a tree, feeling foolish and uneasy in equal measure. Madison? He tried again. This time 3 voices answered, overlapping. Down here. Help me. So cold. Chris's blood turned to ice water. That wasn't possible. He keyed his radio with shaking fingers. Station, I need backup at mile 5 Ho River Trail. Possible. What? Possible what? Possible disorientation. Multiple voices heard, requesting additional SAR personnel. Static. Then barely audible through interference. Hayes. Alone out there. No one. Since what? Station. Repeat. The radio died completely. Chris stared at it, then at the forest around him. The light had changed. Dimmer now, though it should be getting brighter as morning advanced. The shadows between the trees seemed denser, more substantial. He had the sudden irrational feeling that if he looked too long into those spaces, something would look back. Get a grip, he told himself. You're a professional. There's a rational explanation. But his hand found the small scar on his left forearm, thumb tracing the line of it through his sleeve. The scar from 5 years ago, when he'd learned that rational explanations didn't always apply in places like this. He kept moving, following the trail deeper into the forest. Every 50 feet he called Madison's name. Every 50 feet, the silence answered. Or worse, those voices returned, never quite close enough to pinpoint, never quite far enough to ignore. At mile 5.3, he found her tent. It was set up properly, rainfly secure, gear organized in the vestibule. But the zipper was torn open from the inside, the fabric shredded as if something had clawed its way out in a panic. Chris approached slowly, noting everything. Boots still inside, neatly placed. Water bottle, 3/4 full. A paperback novel bookmark at page 127. No sleeping bag, no Madison. He photographed everything, then carefully searched the tent's interior. Her phone was there, battery dead. He pocketed it. Maybe he could charge it later, check her photos. A journal lay open, and Chris hesitated before reading the last entry. September 14th, 2011, 6:30 p.m. The forest is different than I expected. More alive, somehow. I keep hearing things, not animal sounds exactly, but almost like whispers. Probably just the wind through the moss. Rangers at the visitor center said the Hoh is known for its acoustic properties. Still, I'm glad I brought the tent. Going to read for a bit before sleep. Tomorrow I'll push for Blue Glacier Overlook. Mom would love it here. Wish she could see it. The entry ended there, but at the bottom of the page, written in a different pen and shaky handwriting, they're not whispers. They're saying names. How do they know names? Chris read it 3 times, his skin crawling. That second entry wasn't in the same handwriting, it was more frantic. Letters barely formed. Written in the dark, maybe. Or by someone whose hands couldn't quite steady. He stepped out of the tent and surveyed the area. The sleeping bag wasn't far. He found it 20 feet away, dragged through the moss and left in a crumpled heap. No blood. No signs of struggle beyond that initial panic in the tent. Just abandonment. Madison! His voice was raw now. Madison Parker, if you can hear me, please respond. The voices came back immediately, and this time they were closer. Christopher. His full name. Not Hayes or Ranger, but his first name, spoken in a dozen overlapping tones, male, female, young, old, all at once. He spun in a complete circle, seeing nothing but trees and shadows. Who's there? Christopher Hayes. Closer still. We remember you. No. No, this wasn't happening. 5 years. He'd avoided this section of the forest for 5 years specifically to avoid this. Where is Madison Parker? He forced the words out, made them a demand rather than a question. Laughter rippled through the trees. But it wasn't one laugh. It was many, twisted together like the voices, some gleeful and others anguished. The sound had texture, physical weight. It pressed against his eardrums. She heard us, the voices said. She listened. Not like you, Christopher. You ran. I'm here now, he said, and hated how his voice shook. Let her go. Let her go? The voices sounded puzzled, almost childlike. We don't have her. She has us. Inside her head. Swimming in her thoughts. Can you feel it, Christopher? The way we get in? And God help him, he could. That familiar sensation like cold water seeping through cracks in his skull. The same feeling from 5 years ago, when he'd been searching for a missing hiker named David Chen, and had spent 3 days convinced he was going insane. He'd found Chen eventually, or what was left of him, at the base of a cliff he'd apparently thrown himself from. No note, no explanation, just gone, with that same expression of terror frozen on his face. The official report said disorientation, possible hypothermia-induced hallucinations, accidental fall. Chris had written it himself. What else could he write? I found him after 3 days of being hunted by voices that knew things they shouldn't know, that spoke with the mouths of dead people, that made me doubt everything I saw. He'd requested a transfer afterward, got denied, took a month of leave instead and came back determined to avoid this trail system entirely. But here he was, because Madison Parker's mother had begged him, because it was his job, because part of him, the part he hated, had always known he'd have to come back eventually. Where is she? He said again, quieter this time. The voices moved, flowing through the forest like water through pipes. Follow us, Christopher. We'll show you. We'll show you everything. He knew it was a mistake. Every instinct, every training protocol, every survival rule said, don't follow the voices. Return to the trailhead. Call for backup. Wait for daylight and support teams. But he thought of Madison Parker's mother, her voice cracking on the phone. He thought of Madison's journal entry, the terror in that second scrawled line, and he followed. The voices led him off trail, deeper into the old growth. The forest here was cathedral vast, columns of ancient spruce rising 200 feet overhead. The moss hung so thick it filtered the light into a permanent green twilight. His boots sank 4 inches into the forest floor with each step, and the sound of the river faded to nothing. He tried to mark his trail, breaking branches, stacking stones. But when he looked back, his markers seemed farther apart than they should be, as if the forest was stretching when he wasn't looking. "You're wondering if you're crazy," the voices said, conversational now. "You wondered that last time too." "Shut up." David Chen wondered, right up until the moment he jumped. Or did he fall? You never decided. Shut up. But the question is interesting, isn't it, Christopher? How do you tell the difference between real and unreal when the unreal can touch you, speak to you, lead you exactly where it wants? He stopped walking. What are you? What are we? The voices laughed again, that terrible chorus. We're what happens when too many people die in the same place. When their last thoughts, their terror, their confusion, when it all soaks into the forest like blood into soil. We're memory without a body, consciousness without an anchor. We're the question you keep asking yourself, am I going insane? Chris's hand found his knife, though he knew it was useless. You're not real. Then why are you talking to us? He had no answer for that. The voices moved again, and he followed, because what else could he do? The forest seemed to shift around him, paths appearing and disappearing. Time became strange. Minutes felt like hours or seconds, he couldn't tell. His watch said 10:47 a.m., but the light seemed wrong for that. Too dim. Finally, they brought him to a place he'd never seen before. It was a depression in the forest floor, roughly circular, maybe 60 feet across. The trees around it leaned inward at impossible angles, their trunks bent toward the center like they were bowing. The moss here was different, darker, almost black, and it moved, not from wind, just moved, pulsing gently like the forest was breathing. In the center of the depression, Madison Parker knelt in the moss. "Madison," Chris started forward, but the voices surged. "Stop." He froze. Madison didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. She was still wearing the red jacket, but her hair had come loose from its ponytail. She knelt with her hands pressed into the moss, and her lips were moving soundlessly. "Madison?" He tried again, softer. This time she looked up, and Chris's stomach dropped. Her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye, sclera and all, reflecting no light. When she spoke, it was with those same overlapping voices. "Hello, Christopher. We've been waiting." "That's not Madison," he said to himself more than anyone. "No," the voices agreed, now coming from her mouth. "But she's still in here, listening, learning. Soon she'll be part of us like the others, like David Chen, like Sarah Morrison from 2006, like Thomas Brennan from 1998, like the logging crew from 1952, all 8 of them, lost in a single day, like the Quileute guide from 1873 whose name no one remembers anymore. We're all here, Christopher. Everyone who came too deep, everyone who listened too long." Chris forced himself to breathe. Let her go. Why? She's happier now. No more fear, no more doubt, just us, forever, thinking together. She doesn't want that. Are you sure? Madison's mouth smiled, but the expression was wrong. Too many emotions at once. Ask her. Madison, do you want to leave? For a moment the voices stopped, and Madison's eyes cleared. Just her own brown eyes, wide and terrified. Her real voice came out in a desperate whisper. Chris, they won't stop talking. I can't think, please. Then the black returned, swallowing the brown, and the voices rushed back. See? She's confused. We're helping her. Soon she won't remember being separate at all. Chris's mind raced. 5 years ago he'd run from this. He'd heard the voices, felt them trying to get inside his head, and he'd refused to listen. He'd covered his ears, recited baseball statistics, hummed songs, anything to fill the silence they needed to enter. And eventually they'd let him go, because he had nothing they wanted, but he'd left David Chen behind. "How do I fight you?" he asked. "You can't," the voices said simply. "We're already in your head, Christopher. Have been since you entered the forest. Every thought you think we're part of now. Every memory you have, we're tangled in. Can you even remember this morning clearly? Or does it feel distant, dreamlike?" He tried to remember, the phone call, the drive, the trailhead. But the voices were right. It was all fuzzy, like looking through frosted glass. When had that started? Mile 4? Mile 2? The station, he thought suddenly. Had there even been a phone call? "There it is," the voices said, delighted. "The doubt. That's the crack we need. Wander with us, Christopher. Did you really drive here, or have you been walking in circles for hours, days? Is there really a Madison Parker? Or did we make her up, make all of it up, just to get you here?" "No," he said, but his conviction was crumbling. "Your hands are shaking. They've been shaking since before the phone call, since yesterday, since last week. You've been coming apart for a long time, haven't you, Christopher? Ever since David Chen. Ever since you left him to us. I tried to save him." "Did you? Or did you run because you were afraid, and now you're back and you're afraid again, but you're trying so hard to be brave, to be the hero? But what if there's nothing to save? What if Madison Parker is just another voice in your head? What if you're already one of us?" His vision swam. The trees leaned closer. The moss beneath his feet felt suddenly insubstantial, like he might fall through it into nothing. "Come closer," the voices said from Madison's mouth. "Kneel with us, we'll show you what really happened 5 years ago. We'll show you the truth about David Chen, about yourself. Isn't that what you want? To finally know?" Chris took a step forward, then another. It would be so easy. Just kneel down, put his hands in the moss, and finally understand. Finally stop doubting, stop questioning, stop being afraid. His knee touched the ground. Then his hand found the scar on his arm again. The one thing he knew was absolutely real, because he'd gotten it right before he escaped 5 years ago. Not from the voices, from himself, using his own knife to cut through his sleeve when he'd been fumbling with his pack. A stupid accident. But it had been real pain, real blood, real consequence. He pressed his thumb into the scar until it ached, using the sensation to anchor himself. Then he pulled his knife and drew it across his other palm. Not deep, just enough to sting, to bleed. The pain was real. The blood was real. Which meant he was real. "Madison Parker is real," he said aloud. "She's 19 years old. She studies forestry at University of Washington. Her mother called me at 6:47 a.m. I drove to the trailhead. I found her tent at mile 5.3. She's here, and she's alive, and she's not you." The voices screamed, actual screaming, like wind through a canyon. The trees shook. The moss rippled in waves. "You don't know that," they raged. "You don't know anything. We're in your head, Christopher. We're in your memories. We've always been there. Even before you came to this forest, we're part of you now." He gripped the knife tighter, his palm slick with blood. Maybe. But Madison Parker isn't. He moved forward in a rush, reaching for her. The voices shrieked, and Madison's body convulsed, trying to pull away. But he grabbed her wrist, her solid, physical, real wrist, and pulled her up from the moss. Her eyes cleared again just for a second. "I can't. They won't." "Then I'll carry you," he said, and threw her over his shoulder. The forest exploded. Every tree erupted with voices. Hundreds of them, all screaming different words. Stay, go, help, run, mother, forgotten, cold, David, Sarah, Thomas, Christopher, Madison, real, unreal, inside, outside, everything, nothing. The moss beneath his feet turned liquid. He staggered, nearly fell, but forced himself forward, away from the depression, away from whatever that place was. The voices pursued, swirling around him. You're making a mistake. She's already one of us. You're carrying a shell. You're carrying your own delusion. You're carrying nothing. Madison's weight on his shoulder was real. He focused on that. The pressure, the physical strain, real. Even if you escape, the voices hissed. You'll never know for sure. You'll look at her and wonder, is this Madison? Or is this what we want you to see? You'll wonder for the rest of your life. He pushed through a curtain of moss, branches clawing at his face. His GPS was useless. The screen showed random numbers, coordinates that couldn't exist. The compass in his pocket spun wildly when he checked it. He moved by instinct, by feel, by prayer. The voices grew more desperate. Christopher, please, we're lonely. We don't want to be alone. Don't leave us alone. Don't leave her alone. We're all she has now. We're all anyone has here. The forest keeps us. The forest needs us. His legs burned. Madison had gone limp over his shoulder. Unconscious or just exhausted, he couldn't tell. The forest seemed endless, every direction identical. Had he passed that tree before? That fallen log? Everything looked the same. You're walking in circles, the voices sang. Round and round and round. You'll die here too, and then we'll have you both forever. Won't that be nice? All of us together. Never alone again. His vision tunneled. His breath came in ragged gasps. How long had he been walking? Hours? Days? His watch said 11:03 a.m., but that couldn't be right. It had said 10:47 before, hadn't it? Time didn't work here. Nothing worked here. Then, impossibly, he heard water. The Ho River. Real, solid, undeniable. He staggered toward the sound, the voices shrieking behind him. No, 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 stay, stay, stay. He broke through the trees and nearly fell into the river itself. The trail was right there, solid and marked. Mile marker 4. He'd somehow found his way back. The voices cut off abruptly like someone had slammed a door. Silence rushed in, so sudden and complete it hurt his ears. Chris collapsed on the trail, Madison sliding from his shoulder. He checked her pulse. Steady, strong. She was breathing normally, eyes closed, peaceful, like she was just sleeping. For a long moment he just sat there, bleeding palm pressed against his leg, trying to remember how to think clearly. The morning sun cut through the canopy in normal shafts of light. Birds called in the distance. The river burbled past. Everything was ordinary. Had it been real? Any of it? Madison stirred, moaning softly. Her eyes fluttered open, brown eyes, normal eyes, and she looked at him in confusion. What? Where? You're safe, he said, his voice wrecked. You're on the Ho River Trail. I'm Ranger Hayes. Your mother reported you missing. Missing? She sat up slowly, looking around. I had my tent set up. I remember going to sleep. Then, her face went pale. The voices. Oh God, the voices. I know, he said quietly. Were they real? She looked at him with desperate intensity. Please tell me they were real. Because if they weren't, if I imagined all of that, he should tell her yes, should confirm it, give her that certainty. But he thought of what the voices had said. You'll never know for sure. I heard them too, he said finally. It was the only truth he could offer. They sat in silence for a moment. Two people who'd been to a place that shouldn't exist and made it back. Maybe. Can you walk? He asked. She nodded. He helped her up, and together they made their way down the trail toward the trailhead. It took 3 hours. Normal time, normal distance. When they emerged from the forest, his truck was right where he'd left it, and other rangers were already there, part of a search team he'd apparently requested that morning. The lead ranger, Marcus Webb, rushed over. Hayes, thank God. We got your call about the missing hiker. Is this... Madison Parker, Chris said. Mild dehydration, possible hypothermia, but stable. They took her to the hospital in Forks. She was treated and released the same day. Her mother cried and hugged Chris and called him a hero. He accepted it because what else could he do? The official report was simple. Madison had become disoriented after leaving her tent during the night, possibly sleepwalking. She'd wandered off trail and experienced auditory hallucinations due to stress and exhaustion. Ranger Hayes had located her using standard search protocols. No evidence of foul play. Case closed. Chris wrote it himself, just like he'd written David Chen's report 5 years ago. That night, he sat in his apartment, staring at the scar on his left arm, then at the fresh cut on his right palm. Both real, both proof he'd been there, done something, saved someone. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Thank you for bringing me back. But sometimes I still hear them. Do you?" He stared at the message for a long time. Should he respond? Tell her yes, that he hears whispers in every quiet room now, that he checks mirrors to make sure his reflection moves when he does, that he sometimes wonders if he really made it out of the forest or if he's still there walking in circles while something else wears his face and lives his life. Instead, he typed, "You're safe now. They can't reach you here." A lie. Or maybe the truth. He honestly didn't know anymore. He deleted the message without sending it, turned off his phone, and sat in the darkness of his apartment, listening to the silence and trying very hard not to hear anything beneath it. In the forest, the voices continued their conversation, adding 2 new threads to their eternal weaving, one faint, one strong, both permanent. The moss grew over Madison's abandoned tent. The river flowed on, and the trees leaned together, keeping their secrets. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more immersive stories. What's your interpretation of what really happened in the forest? Were the voices real supernatural entities or manifestations of psychological trauma? I'd love to read your theories in the comments.